Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, a deck that is sent by donation from Shirok. Thank you, as always, Shirok, for supporting our channel so much. This is a fun week for me. I recently got myself the new computer, and I'm slowly piecing everything back together, remembering to install everything. And we've got some video editing software for me to learn, and a few other surprises coming up. So I'm hoping you guys will stay tuned, and hopefully I'll have something real silly for you guys soon-ish, let's say. But looking at this deck, we've got a fun one today. Fun one if you're playing the deck, not so much fun if you're playing against it. This is a Hatebears deck. For those who do not know what that means, well, it is a deck that aims to gain advantages by taking away your opponent's abilities to kind of play the game. But unlike what we would call stacks, this does it kind of slowly and in very, very specific increments. I think these two strategies kind of blend when you go far enough down the power line towards EDH, but for mid to high power, and I would consider this mid to high power, generally it's about stripping abilities from your opponents one at a time. But we'll see that in the deck list. Looking at Shirok's comment, they say, in what needs improvement, they need a win con, and functionality needs improvement, maybe a bit of power. I find this a little interesting because I think the deck is already in a really, really good place. I think it's very powerful and has some very straightforward win conditions, but we will suggest some to kind of up the ante. And when it comes down to budget, it's not applicable, so we have no budget here, which is great. And I think I'm just going to make a note here and misspell that. Perfect. We'll see that later. And I think with that, we're good to take a look at our commander and see what this deck does. So Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, they're a duo, a 4-mana, 4/4 human frog horror in Abzen colors. That's white, black, and green. They have First Strike and Death Touch, and they say you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Then they say creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever this creature attacks, sacrifice a creature or land, then draw a card. Whew, that's a lot of text. I think this was the first rare I picked up on the pre-release when this set came out, and I traded away to a friend who really does like land decks, so he built a commander deck out of it, and I think he's very happy with it. This is very, very interesting and a very, very strong card. I do really, really like it. It does so much, so we're going to go through it like really quickly. The first thing to consider is this creature is almost impossible, to block reasonably, right? You need 4 or more creatures to block it in order because of the First Strike Death Touch, that they only need to put 1 point of damage onto each creature, and therefore they can very easily block 4 creatures and destroy them. And then you need all of those 4 creatures to have at least 4 power, so that no matter how Thalia is blocked, she will die. Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, I should say, the duo, will die after combat. But even then, that's quite a board to be packing, and that's not including any form of protection that can be given to Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, so it's really, really hard to deal with this creature as an attacker, or a blocker, to be honest. And then the second ability, getting extra lands every turn, allows you to get further, more advantage from your opponents, and lets you take advantage of a lot of card draw or card advantage that might leave extra lands in your deck. There's a lot of that in the deck, and I will be suggesting a few more because I find it to be one of the strongest things, this card brings. After that, you've got the general kind of damper on your opponents to make their non-basics and creatures come in tapped, which is really nice because it always puts you almost like a turn ahead because they have to wait for their non-basics to untap. Specifically, their fetch lands are the hardest because they can't, fetch Shock. They might fetch Triome, but it just takes so long for them to get the cards that they want if they're not grabbing basics. And their creatures being tapped allows you to have really profitable attacks. And then finally, the draw engine is just really, really nice. I think generally you tend to pick lands more than creatures to sacrifice, as you do really need your creatures in a Hatebears deck. But I think on the basis of how this deck is built, it's going to be lands you're going to sacrifice, and you're going to be really happy turning those lands into card draw. So all that to say, this is a fantastic commander, and let's take a look at the deck itself. Now, I think the deck is already in a really great place. The curve is really, really nice. It's set up against a lot of different strategies. So what are those strategies? And let's talk a little bit more about Hatebears and the functionality of a Hatebears deck. So when we talk about Hatebears, I think the classic one, we don't have it here, but Ethersworn Canonist is a really good example. So Hatebears tend to be creatures that are low in power and toughness, low in mana cost. Usually the bear status is a 2/2 for 2. So Ethersworn Canonist is a really good example. And then they have an ability that is very detrimental to a specific play style. Now, Hatebears themselves do not completely cripple all decks. One card will never defeat all decks, but they each will fight a different kind of deck. So a really nice example is Ethersworn Canonist says that players who try to cast more than one spell, as if they're not non-artifact spells, will get into a problem. So artifact decks won't mind this, but almost any like storm deck, any kind of value deck, any kind of deck that tries to cast a lot of spells, like I would say tribal decks especially are very much so not a fan of this card. It really puts a damper on their ability to build a board or be in the game. It's also very noteworthy that a card like this is really, really strong against simple cards like Dark Confidant, Rhystic Study, Necropotence, any form of card that gives you turn after turn card advantage. Well, if they're not like really heavy into flash or instant speed, what you're doing is you're limiting the number of cards they can play out of their hand. So let's just imagine that they're able to, they don't have a lot of artifacts, and they're, let's say, tribal. So let's say they're playing an elf deck, and they don't have flash either. So what this means is every turn they get to play a land and they get to play an elf. Now, if they have a setup where every time they play an elf, they draw 2 cards, well, they've kind of broken parity, right? They draw a card each turn, they play an elf, and they draw 2 additional cards. So in theory, each turn they are at minimum drawing 3 cards, but because of Ethersworn Canonist, they can only play 2 of those cards. So though you might say, well, Cursed, drawing 3 cards will always let them find the right answers, maybe even something to destroy Ethersworn. That's true, but as long as Ethersworn is out and it is uninterrupted, one of those cards is being wasted, not including the rest of the cards in their hand that aren't being played. Turn after turn, you are getting ahead because your opponents just cannot develop their board as fast as you can. And once again, that's not even counting, Thalia's ability. Looking at another type of Hatebear, Hushbringer is a really good example of one that has a very wide net. Hushbringer is very harmful to both ETB, so blink decks, flicker decks, a lot of generically powerful decks, but it also stops dying triggers, so aristocrats, anything that generally benefits from graveyards, so it doesn't have to be full into aristocrats, but graveyard builds, reanimation builds sometimes. This is just really, really, really strong. And once again, all of these different kinds of cards, they tend to have kind of multiples of them. So Phyrexian Censor, and where is our flying? I assumed there it is, Archon of Emeria, and over here, Rule of Law, and what we just said, Ethersworn Canonist, all kind of do the same thing. So we have a lot of utility, like we have a lot of different versions of the card, so even if we lose 1 or 2, we're still in the game and we can still come back. Likewise, I think we can also see something like regular Thalia. As soon as I find her, I feel like I'm having a hard time finding cards. There we go. Regular Thalia also somewhat is softer but still applicable in that kind of strategy of stopping spells. Sorry, I'm just typing one more out. There we go. There's been a lot of cards that I've thought of while we were doing this. So that's Hatebears. Hatebears is this idea that all of, I missed Eidolon of the Rhetoric. That's another one. And we're going to talk about those in a second. But we can see all of these creatures. The majority of our deck, 38 out of 100, are creatures, 39 including our commander. And so we're a very creature-centric deck, and we're trying to use the right cards at the right time. So with that in mind, let's talk about our creatures and our strategies and talk about what I like and what I don't like. So there's a few things missing, I find, but we're going to take a moment to get to those. And those will be in my additions. So instead, let's see what's here and what the numbers kind of are. So it's important to note that certain, hitting on certain strategies will just be more effective than hitting on other strategies. There's like a bit of a tier list. For example, Dauthi Voidwalker is something that hates on graveyards. We have a few other cards that kind of do this here and there, like Kurnos, and do we have Rip? We don't have Rip, but we could have Rip. We have, exile-based effects, but something like Dauthi Voidwalker that hurts everyone's graveyard, all your opponent's graveyards, is a very, very high ceiling. Almost all decks use their graveyard to some extent, including this one. And so an effect like this has a lot of value. You play this and you're going to get a lot of advantage out of it almost universally. So we really like Dauthi Voidwalker. It's very, very strong. Another one that's obviously kind of, I think it's one ahead. Yeah. Another one that is the poster child of this kind of strategy now is Drannith Magistrate. Drannith Magistrate, that stops your opponents from casting spells anywhere from your hand, other than their hands, is instrumental in Commander, where your opponent's commanders are outside of their hand. So once again, very, very high ceiling, always useful. You're very happy. That's not even including the way it interacts with certain combos or casting from exile. Drannith Magistrate is a very, very strong card. However, I think a few of these are maybe a little in too high number. And the one that really catches my eye is the Rule of Law effect. Like earlier in this video, I tried to count them and I even missed one. So let's take a look. We have Rule of Law, that's 1. We have Deafening Silence, that's 2. We have Ethersworn Canonist, that's 3. We have Eidolon of the Rhetoric, that's 4. We have Phyrexian Censor, that's 5. And is that really it? I'm starting to worry. Did I miss the Archon of Emeria again? I did. That should be 6, right? Or 7? Oh no. Oh no. Let's say 6 or 7. I don't want to count them again. But I would suggest this is a lot. This is almost 10% of your deck. And that's not even including that we have access to tutors like Diabolic Intent, tutors like Eladamri's Call that allow us these cards, and also Green Sun Zenith, that allow us to get extra copies. So I think easily 10% of our deck is an anti-storm, anti-multicast card. And I think, personally, that's a little overkill. Now, I don't know what metas you're expecting. I don't know who you're playing this with, but I think I would be fine cutting that down to like 5. With the tutors, I think you have the ability to grab which ones you want, and I don't think you need the full 5. We can kind of look which ones are the strongest ones. I would say the lower mana ones, Deafening Silence, Ethersworn Canonist, Archon of Emeria, and possibly I think maybe then I do want Rule of Law as a non-creature one, but it's close. I would say it's close. So the lower mana ones would be the ones I would start with. And I think that's kind of where I would end it there, because I don't think you need that ability so many times. There is an upper limit to the amount of times that you can use this. Without hitting some kind of wall where, the redundancy doesn't change anything. Something like Phyrexian Censor is already a really, really good card that says each player can cast more than one non-Phyrexian spell each turn. I'm going to tell you right now, most people don't have a lot of Phyrexian spells. Until that Phyrexian player comes and sits down when they're using Phyrexian Tribal, you're pretty fine. Like this just basically reads as rule of law, right? And I do like this, actually. I will say the fact that this has the non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tap might put that above rule of law. But the rule of law effect does just kind of end it here and just say, you know, just one spell a turn. So having extra copies of these cards, I don't think is rather good. Now, the rest of these I do rather like. I don't think we have too many problems. I think something we're lacking here that I notice is we have cards like Braids and Bitter Blossom that are meant to go together. And I don't know to what degree. I guess Braids destroys lands, so I think Braids is fine. Okay, we'll come back to Bitter Blossom in a second. Let's do that now. Let's look through the cards individually, see which ones kind of stand out at me, because I think otherwise the deck is really nice on its themes. Sorry, this is a bit of a complicated deck to kind of take in all at once, so let's skip ahead and look at individual cards that I don't particularly like. Renin Realmbreaker, I think, is just a little weak for this deck. I think the -2 is nice, but even then, I don't think this is the card advantage engine you really, really want. I think this would be fine being like a Phyrexian Arena or any other card advantage engine, and I really don't think the lands you control have plus like add 1 mana of any color, like the Chromatic Lantern effect, is really that important. You have a very good mana base. I don't see this being a problem. So overall, I think this is one of the weaker cards. It is a neat card. I do like Remnant and Realmbreaker, but I don't see it as good here. Going through a little further, I think the next card that I see that I'm a little less interested in would be... See, Ewit is interesting to me. Ewit, when it's around, when we have something like Hushbringer, is a bit tougher because Ewit is a card that just does not do anything outside of its ETB. A lot of your other ETB cards do something no matter what, whereas, like under Hushbringer, whereas Eternal Witness, I feel, is a bit weaker. I still think it's obviously worth playing, but it does poke out at my eyes. All right, Kurnos. Kurnos is a card that I don't particularly like in Hatebears because this is a card whose hate effects are too symmetrical, right? You interrupting the ability to cast from graveyards does affect you. We have a card here, Conduit of Worlds, which is really, really good. And it stops you from having any reanimation effect at all, while this doesn't necessarily stop other things, right? This doesn't stop a player who is reanimating non-creature permanents, right? Now that's relevant, like Conduit of Worlds, right? We can use this to cast, let's see, Deafening Silence again without getting problems with Kurnos, but we are limited in that scope, right? The majority of we want to cast from our graveyard are our creatures. So an opponent who's like, I'm thinking of another card to add already, our opponent who is trying to, let's say, bring sagas back, something we've seen a lot recently in our decks, our opponent that's trying to bring sagas back is just going to have a much easier time, and you're not going to be able to punish them with Kurnos, whereas you are going to have I guess it doesn't even matter, sorry, because Conduit of Worlds is always cast and you can't cast them. So an opponent that is using something like Anixthea, which doesn't even bring them back from the graveyard, to be fair, or like Sun Titan to bring back, sagas into play, Kurnos is just not going to do anything while stopping you from having the same kind of benefit. So overall, Kurnos just feels like the wrong version of this. I think I'd just rather rip, honestly, just rest in peace, or I think I'd rather anything else that's like non-symmetrical, something that just exiles all opponents' graveyards. I'm not going to necessarily suggest this because it's 5 mana, but a card that I've really, really liked in the past is Author of Shadows, as it is an ETB to exile. So it's a nombo with Hushbringer, but otherwise, ETB exile all cards from opponents' graveyards, and then you get one of those cards that you can cast for the rest of the game, even if Author of Shadows goes away. So this is a one-time thing, but I do really like it instead. I think it is a very, very strong ability. But coming back here, Kurnos just feels like it just doesn't do enough. Like, it's really, really good against one or two specific kinds of decks, but both of those decks are like, so if we're talking about a, you know, a Yog, not a Yawgmoth's Will, but like yeah, I guess it's Yawgmoth's Will, right? Maybe I got it wrong, but a card that is a storm deck that is trying to cast a bunch of creatures, or sorry, a bunch of spells from their graveyard. Well, you already have enough hate in the deck for that, so Kuranos feels kind of tacked on. And the other version this is strong against is just Reanimator. And Reanimator decks are black-based and definitely have ways to deal with Kuranos, so they're not too worried about you either. So I find this card just kind of exists in kind of a weird nebulous space, so I don't particularly like it. Looking a bit further along, I think the next one that pops into my mind is God Eternal Oketra. So God Eternal Oketra, I find, is kind of, it doesn't really do anything. Getting a 4/4 every turn with Vigilance is neat every time you cast a creature. But remember, with enough Rule of Law spells, that is just one a turn, likely to be just one a turn. And that's not that much of an army. You already have a really good 4/4. It's just a slow build. And that's all she does, right? She is a 3/6 double strike, and you can attack with her with impunity because if she dies, she'll just come back. But even then, like, it's just not a big clock. It's not very strong. She's not a hate bear. She's not like furthering your game plan of locking your opponents out. She's just a threat. And for all the kinds of different threats you can have in these colors, I think she's not a very strong one and not a particularly synergetic one. So I would cut God Eternal Oketra very, very easily. Then the next one, and this is kind of a personal choice, Archon of Valor's Reach just never impresses me. I just feel like it doesn't do enough outside of Bant decks where you can clone it multiple times. Because to me, this card is good if you can clone it with enough times to lock your opponents mostly out of the game. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 5 different types that are non-creature, non-battle, because this is pre-battle. So 5 different types of cards. So you need 5 copies of this, and with that, they can only play creature cards or battles. And considering battles are in short supply, it's probably going to be just creature cards. Then when you have that in play, you have 5, 6 flying vigilance trample creatures, and you're likely to win the game. But in in the year 2023 in Commander, opponents' answers to creatures or any kind of permanents are not just in instants and sorceries. You know, we have enchantments that are readily available. We have artifacts that are readily available. We have creatures with ETB abilities that can destroy creatures that, completely turn off this card because it can't even stop creatures. We have planeswalkers with removal. It's just, there's no longer, a key card we can pick to shut down our opponents. We can say, oh, I'm worried about board clear, so I'm going to say sorcery. Yeah, but that board clear is now just one instant or, instant spell away, or ETB on a creature away from destroying or bouncing your creature and then wiping the board anyways, right? So it's just not a very, very good creature. I think the niche would be, and I can kind of see it here, where you have all of the different hate for all of the different types of cards, and so you play this and you look at the enchantment player and say, okay, you're out of the game. And at 6 mana, I think that's just like not very reliable. If this was a weaker creature at a lower mana cost, I would probably like it. But the problem is that it has a very, very strong body in addition to a strong ability. So I just think it's just clunky to play, and I would easily cut this. Looking through sorceries, I'm going to say something interesting. I'm going to say, don't play Armageddon. And I have some reasoning for this. The first reasoning is that though we do play Crucible, and I'm going to suggest another Crucible effect, I have a better option for this. I think, yes, our deck is able to build ourselves up outside of an Armageddon. I think I think it's not the most ideal way to end a game because we are setting ourselves to neutral. And don't get me wrong, there's a very high chance that we just win the game here, especially if we have the right Hatebears. It's not guaranteed, and we still need to rebuild our board to take out our opponents. We can't sweep our opponents in one lethal attack because it's just very difficult with our creature base. So therefore, it feels like not the strongest way to do this. I'm suggesting two additional ways to do this that I think you're going to like a little more, and I think are going to be more of a combo and less of a just play Armageddon and reset the lands kind of situation. So we're going to come back to this effect in a bit. A Diabolic Intent is very interesting to me here because it's a card I really like, but I think I would like it to be any other tutor. And the reason being that your creatures are immensely important to you. You know, I'm usually good with Diabolic Intent. It's just been printed. It's very cheap. It's very good. But the thing is like, let's see what we can get it at outside of promos. Oh, it doesn't have. Interesting. No, it's about $10. Okay. So usually you want that first line of text that says additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. You want this either to be incredibly accessible, which it's not here, or a plus side, like in an Aristocrats deck, which it also is not here. So here, your creatures are so valuable to you that having to sack one for Diabolical Intent is a real cost. So either just, get Diabolic Tutor, just get the better version of this card, or grab something like the Profane Tutor, that's the suspend one, or any of the Vampiric Tutor types, or a 3-mana tutor, just something else. This is too much of a downside for this deck. Looking at the rest, I really like it. I think the last card I'm going to note before we get to lands is Bitter Blossom. I said I would come back to this. Bitter Blossom feels very strange here. I think if you want, if we're looking at this card and you're like, it creates a 1/1 for each turn, you lose a life, and then Thalia sacrifices it on attack, then I would ask you, why not just play Dark Confidant? This seems kind of clunky to have this ability. If you're going to say, well, I want this to be an army, or I want this to be blockers, well, I agree with blockers. Bitter Blossom is really good at creating blockers, but your deck is already built in a way to really impede aggro. From Thalia and Gitrog monster being a defender that almost cannot be attacked through, to the fact that all of their creatures with haste come in tapped. Like, you're already built for aggro. So Bitter Blossom can only really be here to generate creature tokens, and this is pretty bad. Bitter Blossom is a very popular card, and I get it. The flavor is really good, the ability is really strong, but it's been a really long time since this card has been good, especially in Commander. In Commander, we have to wait an entire turn cycle to get a 1/1. This isn't an each upkeep trigger, or this isn't like, this isn't like Smothering Tithe where it reacts to something that happens often. It's every 4 turns, one for each player, you get a 1/1. And that's just really bad in modern Commander. So for me, this just sticks out as being a really kind of weak inclusion and otherwise a very strong deck. All right. With that in mind, let's just quickly talk about lands. We have 36. I would like this to be between 38 and 40. I know that seems a little high, but I think with a deck that you have so many extra lands per turn, I think you would be really happy just having more, because you can go through it really fast. And once you have enough mana, you can freely go into your finishers, which I kind of glossed over, so I'll get to that in a second. So I think you'd be fine adding I'd say 2 to 3 lands, and you'd be pretty happy. So that would be my suggestion there. You wanted to talk about win conditions. Now I'm going to suggest a few others, but I honestly do think in a deck like this, Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite, Elesh Norn, Mom, not the Mom one. Where's our other? Our Elesh Norn, our Transform Elesh Norn, the Argent Etchings, we should say, is, I would say, honestly, they're good enough. They're really strong. Sheoldred as well is just really good here. especially what is called the True Scriptures. The True Scriptures is just really, really powerful, especially just, I know that last ability of Rise of the Dark Realms is the one we all look at, but each opponent discards 3 cards is really, really strong. Being able to just constantly be destroying your opponents is just really, really good. And when we do get off the Rise of the Dark Realms, it's important to note that because it's exiled and it's returned, we do get another Shieldred trigger to sacrifice more creatures. So the card advantage of Shieldred is insane and will necessarily put you in a very, very advantageous position. And because of how you have a timing system for Shieldred, like you're building towards the counters and you know when it's going to go off, you can play around with some of your cards. Like you can sacrifice your graveyard hate cards in order to make sure that you do get more abilities back. Like if you still play Kuranos, you do have a chance to sacrifice Kuranos before Rise of the Dark Realms. All right, so let's go into additions, and I have a lot more to suggest than I originally thought. I really like this deck. I've said this a few times, but I think the deck is already really, really strong, but I do have suggestions, and as we've gone through the video, I've added at least a few more, so let's start going through them. So first thing that I feel that it's missing is Mother of Runes, Giver of Runes style cards. I think they're noticeably missing. I think you could play both Giver of Runes and Mother of Runes really, really easily, because they're both just very, very strong cards and very, very useful. With all of your Hatebears, they make our removal go so much, they stop our opponent's removal and make our attacks go so much further. And it does make Thalia and Gitrog monster even more of like an unblockable threat, because even now if they block you with 100 Thapperlings with one mom ability, it's meaningless, right? So these two cards I think are really, really easy inclusions that go really well with your strategy. So that's a really nice place to start. All right, let's start going into more Hatebear style cards. Leonin Arbiter is a card that is noticeably missing. Now, granted, you play tutors and you do play, no, there's no fetch lands here. Okay, that's nice. With no fetch lands, Leonin Arbiter is a really, really easy play, and you can play around it yourself. But early on, this is a card I think that is vicious against a lot of decks, because people just tend to forget about it, especially when it comes to land ramp. This card just destroys land ramp really, really easily, and it forces your opponents that keep hands that are just subpar and like are dependent on, a Rampant Growth or a Kodama's Reach. All of a sudden, those hands are borderline unplayable, and it is very, very strong. This card will attract a lot of attention, but I don't need to say that. Every single one of these cards attracts so much attention. If you have Opposition Agent, which is arguably the stronger version of this card, you've got a target on your back anyway, so might as well go all in and play a card like this. Something else, let's go to that next. Let's say Dauntless Dismantler is a newer card. I think this is interesting. I don't know to what degree I like it, but I wanted to suggest it nonetheless. This card has a lot going for it as a 1/4 at the static ability of artifacts your opponents enter the battlefield tapped, and then the sack ability. I think these are all really, really interesting. I think it bears testing. This might be a card that's a little weaker depending on the meta, because sometimes it's just not going to do anything. So it does bear some testing, but at the same time, there are a lot of cards here. Like, over here we have, if people aren't playing artifacts, cards like Collector Oof, cards like Kataki, War's Wage don't do anything anyways. So with that in mind, I think Dauntless Dismantler might grow weaker, but I will say I am going to suggest like at least 2 artifacts. And if you find yourself higher in artifacts, Dauntless Dismantler is better at that point than Collector Oof style cards, because it allows you to keep your artifacts without losing too much, like getting into a bad position and not being able to use your equipment or the like. So that's what I have in mind. So I think this is a strong one. Something that kind of interferes with both this card and equipment cards is Suppression Field. Suppression Field is a really, really powerful card that is Yes, super niche, but I think like definitely worth playing. Now, it's hard to kind of gauge this card. Just as activated abilities cost 2 more mana to play unless they're mana abilities. So what does this hate on? And the answer is nearly everything. So first and foremost, let's get the elephant out of the room. This is really good against fetch lands because all of a sudden their fetch lands cost 2 to cast, and that's, 2 to activate. That's really, really good. But after that, we just start thinking of all of the ways this is just really, really strong, right? So things like any aristocrats build all of a sudden is very, very much so harmed because a lot of them use either infinite combos or infinite sacrifices or a very large amount of sacrifices in one turn. All of a sudden that's off the table. Likewise, a lot of creature-based strategies can use activated abilities on creatures, and all of a sudden that's gone. A lot of engine decks, so a lot of artifact engine decks, a lot of some enchantment engine decks for sure, all of a sudden they don't work. Planeswalkers, all of a sudden all of their abilities cost 2 more. And I don't think there's any battle activated abilities, so I think that one is fine. But otherwise, that's like a huge amount of cards you're hitting, and that's not even including the amount of times that cards like these are non-dedicated strategies. People will put in, you know, I'm trying to think, like planeswalkers into random decks. They're gonna put in, you know, equipment. I don't know if I said equipment. This is obviously very good against equipment as well, but they're going to put equipment into other cards. They're going to play Viscera Seer or Carrion Feeder in general non-aristocrats decks because they're very, very strong cards. And so this card will just hate all of those out of the game. There is one caveat that I'd like to mention, and the problem with this card is that when used with a lot of rule of law effects, it kind of loses its edge. Because if I have 10 mana and I only have 1 card in hand to cast, and it's a 2 mana card, and I have like 1 or 2 activated abilities I want to activate, then this card actually doesn't do anything. It only really works when, you know, your mana is being pressured and you have a lot of things to do. But even with that downside, I think it's just really, really strong. Okay, let's keep going. Kutzil, I think, or Kutzil. This is a really good card. I can't imagine it's going to stay at this price forever. I need to pick up a ton, but I think this card is really, really cool. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, and 1 or more creatures you control with power greater than its base power. When it deals damage, draw a card. So that's 1 per player. This is really, really good. You definitely need a few ways to kind of pump your creatures maybe a little more. Equipment's a really accessible thing. Definitely the Elshnorn Grand Cenobite is a way of doing this. And she's going to be instrumental to a few cards later. But I think even just for 3 mana, your opponents can't cast spells during your turn is just really good on its own. So I think this is a really nice inclusion. After that, we've got some land ones. Ranumap Excavator, you can play lands from your graveyards, and Dryad of the Elysian Grove to give you another land per turn, and that your lands are every basic type. I like Dryad a lot more than I like Ren and Railbreaker, so I think that's a really easy for one trade. But otherwise, I think they're good because you do have land strategies, and I would recommend leaning into them a little more. Ranumap is just also very, very good at grabbing, being your Crucible, your Conduit, and now Ranumap is a nice collection because you really do want to be able to play your lands from your graveyards. Then I have two equipment pieces, which are 2 swords, Sword of Fire and Sword of Ice. Going back to the, sorry, I did that wrong. Sword of Fire and Ice and Sword of Forge and Frontier. It would be interesting if we could split these swords up. If there was, okay, I'm just going to think about this out loud for a second. If there was a Sword of Fire and a Sword of Ice, so like imagine a sword that costs 2 and 1 to equip, gives +1/+1, pro red, and when it deals damage, deal 2 damage to a creature or to a target. Would people play those? I think they would. I think those are strong enough, honestly. I would for sure. I'd put them in my cube for sure. Okay, that's really interesting. I wonder, those would be really interesting custom Magic cards. A cycle of 20 different, I guess you'd cut them down to 5, pick the 5 best of each color, but I think that would be, sorry, the one best of each color. I think that'd be really cool. Okay, anyways, going back, these are really, really strong because you are a creature-based deck, and these do give you some inevitability. One, obviously, they're very, very strong on Thalia and Gitrog, but two, they turn all of your, 2/2s, your bears, into kind of threats. And they give you incentive to attack. They give you the ability to attack with the card advantage that they provide and the protection that they provide. So both of these I think are really, really good. I think you're generally going to be happy with either of these. And obviously Forge and Frontier gives you just another land drop, which is really, really nice. All right, before we get into the silly stuff, let's do two of the more serious cards. Lurrus of the Dream Den feels particularly missing here. I think this card is just really, really good considering the number of 2-drops that you have in your deck that you can cast, not including things like Deafening Silence that you could also bring back, but a very large majority of your deck can be cast from the graveyard with Lurrus. So I think Lurrus is a very, very easy inclusion here and a straightforward one. Then let's talk about win conditions. And let's go to the really, really standard one. And the really standard one is Helm of Obedience. If you want a one-stop I win button, Helm of Obedience is here for you. The whole idea is that Helm of Obedience and X having to be 1 because X can't be 0 mills an opponent until they get 1 card into their exile, whether it be a creature or not. 1 card goes into their graveyard and then it stops milling. However, if you use your Dauthi Voidwalker or Rest in Peace style effects, which keep your opponent from ever having, a card go into their graveyard, Helm of Obedience is 5 mana to exile their entire deck. So, with that in mind, this always gets me that it's 1 and X here, but it's X here. So I'm going to trust this one here. So for 5 mana, all of a sudden you mill their entire deck. It does only take out 1 opponent per turn cycle, but it is very, very strong. It's using a card, which is Dauthi Voidwalker or Rest in Peace that you already want, though obviously a Voidwalker is stronger here. But with Helm of Obedience, you'll immediately take your opponent out of the game. So I think this is if you want the nice and straightforward win condition, this is the one. It is kind of expensive, depends if you can proxy it or not, but I do think it is a nice and clean win condition here. So I can see the newer version has it at the correct mana. Okay, perfect. But let's go back to Armageddon and what I want to suggest. See, what happened was I was suggesting Dryad Arbor, and I was thinking, oh yeah, we can grab Dryad Arbor, out of our graveyard, out of our deck with Green Sun Zenith, which is really nice, and I think you should play it. Dryad Arbor is a very nice card, and then I was thinking that it's a land creature, and then I was thinking of Elesh Norn, and then I was thinking, let's play Life and Limb. Life and Limb is it requires a bit more synergy to do what you want it to do, but it says all forest and all sapperlings are 1/1 green sapperling forest lands. Ooh. And so with that in mind, we have Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. All lands are forests, and now all those forests are 1/1s, and we have Elesh Norn on the battlefield, which means all of our lands are 3/3 sapperlings, and all of our opponent's lands are dead. So that's a fun combination that I like, that has the ability to immediately turn 1, your lands into attackers, but 2, have that uneven board clear. Now, should you still play Armageddon? Probably, if you really like this idea, but I do like Life and Limb because it is asymmetrical, and people are much, much more willing to concede when you've kept all of your lands and you have a giant board of attackers. And Life and Limb did remind me of Life and Death, though it's only half of the combo. Unfortunately, it doesn't make your opponent's lands into creatures, but it does turn all your lands into 3/3s if you have Elesh Norn. That's cute. But we're really just playing it for death, which we should be playing as reanimation in this deck. And that's going to be my thoughts on the deck. I do think it's already in a good place. There's a few things that stand out to me that I've mentioned that I think make it a little weaker, but this is a strong deck. If you wanted to put in you know, a little more into tutors, a few more fetch lands, you could really pump up the strength of this deck really, really quickly. But honestly, I already see it here. This is a very, very strong deck, and it provides a very, very clear-cut path to winning. And maybe we need like a heroic intervention or something, because you are a bit weak to board clears, but at that point, you know, you need to be weak to something, because otherwise your opponents aren't going to want to play with you very, very often. So I do like the deck. I think it's really strong, and I think it is in a good place. Thank you so much, Gitrog, for sending me this deck. I do appreciate you supporting the channel so much, and I do think the deck is really good. So let me know if you make another draft of it, because I would like to see how it ends up. And if you'd like to send me another draft, there is a link in the video description which lets you send me the draft. And also, if you want to donate to the channel and bring your video to the front of the queue, so it's one of the two videos I make every day, that would be really, well, every day I make videos, that would be fantastic. And of course, if you could like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if this microphone is too loud. I'm still playing with things. I'm gonna have a friend help me do all this really soon, but I'm still figuring it out. And I look forward to seeing all of the decks and how this deck ends up going. All right, good luck.